I think
How are you? This is the area of MVPs.
Yeah, we're finally up there.
Yeah.
Past couple of weeks, past couple of years,
My
been
go-to.
leading to this. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't, but I, okay. I don't like the break life. I don't.
That is. Thank you. I don't think, but I read that, but I have a very small mistake.
Good. Perl. Still gonna wait a couple of minutes. I'm just gonna lights up. We would work for the place the front off and the ones in the back should be on. Yeah. More better.
Let me see what. Thank you.
Huh? I'm recording it via Zoom. Not-
You know, then.
Good. That's it. Good to make a lecture, otherwise we will see.
Must go. Yeah. My argument is.
The 801, we'll give them to 802. We'll give the stragglers on that clock another minute or so. All right. And the picture? It's Russian. It's Russian. Yeah. My Russian's not that good. All right, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to be doing this again. There are faces now that I've become accustomed to seeing when I do this, and it's really great to be back with you and to be learning with you. I said to Lenny before we started tonight that to some degree, everything we've been doing over the past couple of years has kind of been leading to this, which means that maybe I'll hang up the cleats when I'm done here. Got nothing left to say. But you'll see as we go along that we'll try and weave in some of the things that we've talked about in previous years. If you weren't here then, don't worry. I'll do my best to make things clear. I'm actually going to start with kind of a shameless plug. I'm going to do my best over the course of the next 3 weeks to present aspects of the Netziv's life and legacy in a way that is, I hope, educational, engaging, insightful, maybe even entertaining. If when I'm done after the 3 weeks, you feel like there are elements of this that you still want to know more about, and you'd like to sort of dig a little deeper, and you have this deep desire to do it in a way that is far drier, far less interesting, far more academic, then, well, yeah, it was. Yeah, you could go there. But what we're going to do is just some snippets, and hopefully in a way that's far more exciting than what you'll find in there. So, who was the Netziv? Well, this quote maybe perhaps sums him up in the work of Rav Tamchum Freib, a wonderful work, Toldos Beis Hashem B'Volozhin. And he writes, if you want a definitive description of the Netziv with regard to the world of Torah in general and the world of the yeshiva in particular, it would be this, that he was king of the Rosh Yeshivos, Melech, Rosh Yeshivos, and the father of all Bnei HaYeshivos, right? The Av Bnei HaYeshivos. To understand who the Netziv was and his impact on history and why his work and his life still resonates to this day is to see this quote and understand that the world that you know of, that you think of, when you think of the world of yeshiva, what we think of when we think of a Rosh Yeshiva, so much of it traces its roots back to the Netziv and to his work in Volozhin. If, however, you ask your standard yeshiva bacher, what do you know about the Netziv? Chances are they'll tell you maybe something about Volozhin. They'll tell you that he wrote that sefer on Chumash called Hamikdavar, and in all likelihood, they will tell you the story of the shoemaker. Right? I have a few heads nodding. The story of the shoemaker. So that's where I thought we'd begin. We'd begin with the story of the shoemaker. Now, the story of the shoemaker appears in multiple different forms. Let me see if I can move that out of the way over there. Let's see. In multiple different forms and slightly different variations, we're going to look at three different places in which this appears, just to get some sense for the widespread nature of this story and for the different variations in which it often appears. So the first one comes to us from Yeshiva World News, and it reads as follows. Says the Mashgiach, I'm going to go blind if I keep doing it this way. Says the Mashgiach, Rabbi Lubavitch, that if a person has a talent that he is capable of doing, as long as he is capable of doing the task at hand, is as if Hashem commanded him to do so. When the Netziv completed his work on the Sheiltos, after many years of working on it, he made a Seudah. He got up by the Siyum and he started crying. He related that when he was a little boy, he was having a very hard time in yeshiva, as he would struggle daily just to understand what the Rabbi was saying. One night he overheard his parents talking, and they were saying that they were paying so much for his schooling, and yet he just wasn't grasping it. His father wanted him to learn a trade, so at least he could grow up and have a living while staying in Erlich Yid. He wanted him to be a shoemaker. Upon hearing this, he ran out of his room and begged them for one more chance. He said, "Let me try a little harder, and I will do my best to succeed." Said the Netziv, "Imagine had I become an Erlich shoemaker. I would have been God-fearing about tzedakah, and I've opened my home for chesed, but when I would have passed and come up to Shemayim, to the Kisei HaKavod, they would have pulled out my Svarim and asked Naphtali, where are they? Now, Baruch Hashem, I can come up there with this completed perush. I made the effort, and I was capable of writing this extensive work." This is the version you can find on H.com. Allow me to share a story that Netziv Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Berlin lived in Lithuania a few hundred years ago. He was the most famous rabbi of his generation. And it said that in the 40 years he headed the yeshiva in the town of Volozhin, some 10,000 students studied there. The Netziv wrote commentaries on all parts of the Torah. And once, when he published a particularly difficult work called the Amik She'ela, he called together his friends for a special celebration where he told them the following story. When I was a child, I never paid attention in school. Slightly different. I was lazy and did not want to concentrate. Then one day when I was 11 years old, I came home from school and heard my parents talking. My father was explaining how he'd spoken to my teacher, and together they'd concluded that I'd never amount to anything in terms of scholarship. So my father explained he was arranging for me to enroll as an apprentice shoemaker as soon as I became bar mitzvah. I was so shocked by this conversation, I ran to my parents and exclaimed, "I'm so sorry. I've been so negligent with my studies. Please give me more a chance to prove that I'm a good student." And from that day onward, I applied myself to the study of Torah with tremendous vigor and dedication. Since then, I have not wasted a moment, and it's that devotion which has enabled me to write the commentary which we are celebrating today. Then the Netziv continued. But just imagine what would have happened had I not overheard my parents' conversation. I'd probably have ended up a shoemaker. And I've been a pretty good shoemaker besides. But think of what would have happened at the end of my life when I get up to the heavenly court and they'd ask me, "Naphtali, show us what you've done with your life." And I'd proudly show them my beautiful shoes, the fine workmanship, the quality leather, and the exquisite design. And then they'd ask me, "But Naphtali, where are the Svarim you were supposed to publish? Where are your 10,000 students?" And Netziv continued. What would I possibly respond? Beautiful story. Just to show you that it makes the rounds through all sectors of the yeshiva world. It's quoted also in an article in the Commentator on Pragmatic Solution to Women's Torah Learning at YU. This is a classic story of yeshiva learning. Now, many of you know that I wear two hats. I am first and foremost a mechanech. I spend most of my day running schools, And then every once in a while, I play historian, like tonight. And as a mechanic, this story is deeply powerful. It's deeply powerful. We don't actually have a firsthand account of anyone who was at this Su'uda, as far as I know. Right? Anybody who was at the Su'uda and heard the Netziv actually say it. What we do have is we have two much older biographies of the Netziv that do not include this story, but they give us something somewhat similar, a somewhat similar portrayal of the young Netziv. So this comes from a work called Makor Baruch, written by Baruch Halevi Epstein, the author of the Torah Tamima. The English actually comes from the English translation of that book, or of a small piece of that book called My Uncle the Netziv, which caused quite a controversy when it came out. It was put out as a fundraiser for Liquid Yeshiva, and then a few weeks later, after it went out, it was called back, and you were asked to please return it and not read it. Dare say I've read it. It's there on the screen. But okay, so this is a translation of a certain part of that text, and you can see here that he describes the young Netziv as born on the eve of Rosh Chodesh Kislev 1816 in the town of Mir in the Minsk district, and he was of average intelligence. Down here, he writes that because his hard-won learning was not obvious, it took many years until the incredible depth of his knowledge became known. Until that time, he suffered in no small degree from the indifference and condensation of other scholars who relegated him to a status far below their own in the hierarchy of Torah learning. Even his first wife, daughter of HaGaon Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin, fondly known as Rav Itzela Volozhiner, and granddaughter of the famed Rav Chaim Volozhiner, was depressed and chagrined by her husband's lowly position. She was filled with envy at the honor shown by her older sister, wife of the highly acclaimed scholar HaGaon Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried, who ever since his youth enjoyed the distinguished position of an Eloi. Even the renowned Rav Itzela did not seem to take too kindly to his son-in-law. All this changed radically when Rav Itzela, quite by chance, came across his uncle's work on the Sifrei, a parish on the Sifrei, called Emek HaNetziv. He read it, amazed, unable to reconcile the brilliance of the work with his long-held, slightly derisive estimation of my uncle's abilities. He was, to say the least, astonished and found it difficult to believe that the work was original. He began to observe my uncle more closely until he finally reached the unavoidable conclusion that this was indeed an original product of my uncle's exhausting toil. Rav Itzela at last fully comprehended that his son-in-law, held in such low esteem by everyone around him, was as knowledgeable in the treasures of Torah as any of the Gedolim. So not exactly the same story, but a similar type, right? A similar portrait of the type of young man that the Netziv was. And lastly, a work by Meir Bar Ilan. Meir Bar Ilan, born Meir Berlin, writes in his book Rabban Shel Yisrael the following account of his father, the Netziv. His great works, right? This groom, young in his own home and a stranger in his wife's family, had nothing before his eyes but books of Torah written and oral, which he studied and toiled over. That, by the way, hold that note because that's going to be next week's lecture. His great works with which he occupied himself consumed all his senses and feelings, and he paid no attention to or noticed anything happening around his room. It did not occur to him to seek favor and boast before his father-in-law, for he was deeply modest and did not pursue honor or desire praise and compliments. The two men were therefore distant from each other and did not share each other's secrets. Only after the father-in-law, this is a slightly different account here, right? Only after the father-in-law happened to see on his son-in-law's table a letter or two written to him by one of the great men of that generation, Rav David Luria of Bechov. In that letter were words of Torah and expressions of affection, as is customary between two people who respect each other, was the true nature of his son-in-law revealed to him. So in the first account, it was he saw that he was working on this work on the Sifrei. In this account, there were letters, there was correspondence between him and Rav David Luria of Bechov, and that's what opened his father-in-law's eyes. In both cases, the story is somewhat similar. The Netziv's intellectual prowess was either not there or was unnoticed as a young man. So as I said, I wear these two hats, and generally these two hats of mechanech and historian, they fit quite well, and my life, thank God, is really quite harmonious most of the time. There are a few moments when the two actually seem to come in conflict with each other, and I dare say tonight is one of them. As a mechanech, I love this story. I truly do. I think it's an important story. It's a powerful story. It's used to motivate young people that they don't have to be born gifted in order to accomplish incredible things in Torah and elsewhere in life. And I truly, truly believe that. What I don't believe is this story. I don't think it happened. I don't think the story of the Seuda of the Shiltos happened. I don't think the Netziv was a boy of average intelligence. And our lecture tonight will try to make the case, both as to why I don't think that's true and why I think the misconception around the young Netziv developed as it did. So, with that, let's learn a little more about who the Netziv was. The Netziv was born in the town of Mir, in what is today Belarus, a small shtetl. The name is probably familiar to most of you because of the yeshiva today that bears that name. That yeshiva was only first opened, I believe, in 1815, so the year before the Netziv was born. The Netziv did not study in yeshiva in Mir. He studied with his father. His father was his primary teacher as a young boy. His father was not technically a rabbi. His father was a merchant, businessman, but very learned and taught his young son. I think we covered this in one of our lecture series, but I love this picture of Mir because it is sometimes paradigm shifting for people as they think about the Alta Hayim, about the world of Eastern Europe. What is the dominant structure in the cityscape of the city of Mir? Right, which is rather par for the course in shtetl of Eastern Europe. Why? Because the whole idea behind a shtetl was that a shtetl was created to service the peasantry in the countryside. And that's what they did. The peasantry worked in rural lands on the land. And every Sunday they would come generally for church, right? And when they came in, they would need to get all the other services that they couldn't provide for themselves, whether that be going to the goldsmith or to the blacksmith, or getting goods that they couldn't produce themselves, and that's what the Jews did, and the Jews provided that for. So typically, yes, when you walked into a shtetl, even if that isn't the way you painted it in your own imagination, right? So now you can like Photoshop in a church, right? And now you probably have a good sense of what a shtetl looked like. But this was Mir. So he's born in Mir. Mir is a bit southwest of the city of Minsk, and as a young boy, so the Netziv will make his way north to this even smaller shtetl of Volozhin. Volozhin, already at that point, by the time we're now in the 1820s, Volozhin had already established for itself a name as the destination for young men who want to go, young boys who wanted to go and study Torah at its highest level. This is the yeshiva, the famed yeshiva in Volozhin. But to understand the Netziv and to understand my first reason why I don't think the story of the Shoemaker quite fits with the historical reality of the Netziv, we need to understand a little bit of his genealogy and his family tree. This would be a good time to take out your notes and pen, because there's going to be a test on this at the end, and this is going to get kind of complicated. I promise you. The Netziv's story, the story of his roots and his genealogy, is really the story of three different families that are going to come together, three very famous, very important families in the story of 19th century Jewish history. And we start first and foremost with the family of Reb Chaim of Volozhiner. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, we talked about the fact that he's considered to be a student of the Gra. Go back and to your notes on that lecture, and we'll understand what that means, but clearly very much putting forth the carrying forth the legacy, the torch of the Gra, creates the yeshiva in Volozhin. Chaim Volozhiner has 5 kids. Esther, who marries Rav Hillel Fried, you may have remember hearing the name Fried already in one of the sources that we looked at. Rav Yasel Shershover, Rav Itzla Yitzchak, his son Yitzchak, who later becomes known as Rav Itzla of Volozhiner. Rilke, who will marry a man by the name of Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. And if you're thinking, is it that Yosef Ber Soloveitchik? The answer is no, it's not. It's his grandfather. Okay, we're getting there. And Chasa will marry a Mordechai Kamenetsky. No. Grandfather of Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who is the grandfather, right? The great grandfather of the Joseph B. Soloveitchik, right? So this is the grandfather of Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, right? Who is going to be the father of Chaim Soloveitchik, right? And who is the grandfather of Joseph B. Soloveitchik. They like to reuse names in that family. Okay, it's not my fault. Okay, Rav Itzla of Volozhiner. So Rav Itzla of Volozhiner will have 4 children. Right? And by the way, when I say children, these are surviving children. Right? In many of these families, unfortunately, there were children who were lost at a young age. Good. We have Rachel. We have Rivka. Rivka will marry her first cousin, Eliezer Yitzchak Fried, which gives him double yichus to Chaim Volozhiner. Right? Everybody see that? He is a grandson on both sides, right? From Chaim Volozhiner this way, right, and that way. Good. He has a daughter, Reina Batya, and he has a daughter, Peggy, who marries somebody by the name of Eliyahu Zal. Great. Pause there. That's the Volozhiner family. Let's look at another family, and that is the family of Yaakov Berlin. Yaakov Berlin is married to a woman by the name of Batya Mirel. He has 6 children, right? 6 surviving children: Avram Meir, Eliezer Lipa, Netanel, Lipsha, Hirschleib, and Michla. Michla will marry, but they all, by the way, will marry into pretty prominent families. Michla marries into the family of Yechiel Michal Alevi Epstein, who is the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. At least one person's taking notes. I'm impressed. Okay, right? The author of the Aruch HaShulchan. Good. Hirschleib is the Yiddish for, all right, Tzvi Yehuda, right? Or Naftali Tzvi Yehuda, right? Hirschleib, he was known as Hirschleib. That is the subject of our lecture, who will later be known as the Netziv, born in 1816. So Hirschleib will marry Reina Batya Berlin, bringing these 2 families together, right? Hirschleib, the Netziv, marries Reina Batya Berlin. So now his wife is then the daughter of Rav Itzla of Volozhin, the granddaughter of Chaim Volozhiner. Everybody good so far? Amazing, good. Doesn't get any more complicated than this. All right, the Netziv and Reina Batya will have 4 surviving children. Chaim Berlin. Now, if somebody asks me, is it that Chaim Berlin? The answer is yes, it is that Chaim Berlin, and we'll talk more about that a little more later, and then next week as well. Michal Berlin, who we don't know too much about. Sarah Resha will marry somebody by the name of Rafal Shapiro. She will unfortunately die, and so Rafal Shapiro will then marry her sister, Teresa. Okay, good. Time for the 3rd family, and that is the Epstein family. So Michla, we said, Michla, daughter of Yaakov Berlin, will marry Yechiel Michal Levi Epstein. They will have 5 children, Baruch. We've seen that name already, Baruch Halevi Epstein, right? That is the Torah Tamima, son of the Aruch HaShulchan. Okay, good. They have additional siblings, Braina, Dovber, Adel, and Batya Miriam. Now, the Netziv's first wife, Reina Batya, daughter of Itzla Volozhin, granddaughter of Chaim Volozhin, will also die rather young. And so the Netziv will remarry, and he will remarry Batya Miriam, the daughter of Yechiel Michal Levi Epstein. That's his niece. Very good. Yes, he said, yes, it's his niece. Good. So they will have 2 children. Meir Bar Ilan. Is it that Bar Ilan? Yes, it is. It is that Bar Ilan. And Yaakov Berlin, named after the Netziv's father. All right, so if we put these 3 families together, right, this is what we've got so far. Okay, we're all following. Good? Right. All right, we've got 3 families. We've got the Volozhiner family, we've got the Berlin family, we've got the Epstein family, we have the Netziv who marries Reina Batya, has these children. Unfortunately, she passes away. He marries Batya Miriam, and he has these 2 children much later in life. Good. Now, just to take this forward a little bit, to meet some other characters who are going to be part of our story a little bit later on, let's take it one step further. So, Elio Zalman and Fegi, they have a child by the name of Rabbi Yoshua. He wasn't born a rabbi, believe it or not. Yoshua Heschel Levin, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a few moments. Then the Soloveitchik family is obviously going to become quite important as well. And yes, these names are going to repeat, so don't get confused. But this first child in this line is Zev Soloveitchik, who then has a son named Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who will then have a son named Chaim Soloveitchik. That is that Chaim Soloveitchik, Chaim Brisker. Right? This is the Brisker Rav. This is his son, Chaim Soloveitchik. And of course, Chaim Soloveitchik is going to marry the daughter of Sarah Resha and Rav Shapiro, which makes Lifsha Shapiro what to the Netziv? Okay, good. Granddaughter to the Netziv. So Soloveitchiks and the Netziv family are going to come back together again in the form of Chaim Soloveitchik and his marriage to Lifsha Shapiro. Excellent. Good. Let's go back to our story, though, for just a minute. The question we were asking, right, was the Netziv indeed this kind of, average boy of average intelligence, not so smart, right, worked hard, right, and ultimately got somewhere? Well, the first reason I don't think that's true has been in front of you the entire time since we've started talking. Somebody please make the argument for me from what is right now in front of you. The shidduch. Okay, very good. Right? This shidduch that happens, how old is the Netziv when the shidduch was made for him to marry the daughter of Rav Itzela Volozhin, Rosh Yeshiva of the most prominent yeshiva in the world? 16? 15? Do I hear lower? He's 13 years old. He's 13 years old. They get married at 14. 13. So, I just don't see it. I just don't see it. By our best estimation, the Netziv comes to Volozhin at about the age 11. Right? And by 13, the shidduch has been made for him with the daughter of the Rosh Yeshiva. And the other story said it must be about the same age, right? Because you don't send somebody up as an apprentice until about age 12, 13. And it couldn't have been. It couldn't have, certainly not, right? At that time, at that age, right? That's my first argument. Second argument has to do with the sources that we have, right, and the sources that we looked at. So let's take a look again. Those two other sources that we read, which didn't tell the story of the shoemaker, but also seemed to portray him as kind of not, or at least not that his genius wasn't known, at least early on. Right? So those two, the first one came from Baruch Halevi Epstein. Right? And we've already noted that the relationship between Baruch Halevi Epstein is that he is the nephew. Well, he is the nephew, correct, right? Because he brother-in-law, and he is also the brother-in-law of the Netziv, right? But my uncle and brother-in-law, the Netziv, would have been too long of a title, right? So he just used my uncle, the Netziv. The other one is Meir Bar Ilan. Now, what do we notice about these two men? When was Baruch Halevi Epstein born? 1860. The Netziv was born 1816. So the Baruch Halevi Epstein is not around when this story, or when the Netziv is a young man. So anything he says, anything he writes, is things that he's heard, right? For sure. Meir Bar Ilan is born in 1880. How old is the Netziv? 64 when he has Meir Bar Ilan. Right? So he certainly wasn't around during the Netziv's youth. And in fact, the books in which these stories appear, so Baruch Halevi Epstein's book Makor Baruch was first published in 1928, which is well after the Netziv has passed. Well after the Netziv has passed. And Meir Bar Ilan's book, Rabban Shel Yisrael, is published in 1948. Right? So even longer after the death of the Netziv. Now, why is all this important? Because I'm going to show you another very brief biography of the Netziv that is not only written earlier, but written during the Netziv's lifetime. Now, it means something when you write something about somebody when they're alive versus when you write something about somebody when they have passed. Right? The biggest difference between doing history about somebody who is alive and doing history about somebody who has passed is that somebody who has passed can't talk back, right? So you would imagine that somebody who's writing about somebody who is alive may be a little bit more careful about what they're writing, right, than perhaps somebody who has heard stories and legends which have grown, right, since a person's passing. So the text I'm referring to comes from this really incredible journal called Knesset Yisrael, which I, God willing, one day would like to publish something about it because it is just a fascinating work. But it's published in 1887. 1887, the Netziv is still very much alive. Right? He dies in 1893, and part of this fascinating, and again, if you just look at it here, it's a Sefer Shnati Torah U'Leteuda. It almost reads like it was published at YU, right, in 1887, and it's fascinating. The stuff that's in it combines so many different areas of science and poetry and history and economics and the sort of the social world of the Jewish world and Torah. And in this text, in this journal, is our Toldot Anshe Hashem, Midor Ha'avar, Ve'oveh, right? Stories of people from the past and people who are alive today. And amongst those stories is the story of the Rosh Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim, that was the name of the yeshiva in Volozhin. It was called Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. And in this text, we find the following. Od b'yamei ne'urav. Right? Well, sorry, we'll start earlier on. Okay. Agaon Naftali Tzvi Yehuda, Nero Yair, he's alive. The Gaon Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda, may his light shine, is a branch from a noble tree of elders in the city of Mir, which is in the district of Minsk, born to his honorable father, Rabbi Yaakov Berlin of blessed memory, in the year 1860. And when he was about 14 years old, he had already entered the covenant of marriage with the daughter of Gaon Rabbi Yitzchak of blessed memory, the Rosh Mesivta, head of the yeshiva of Volozhin in those days. Even in his youth, it was seen that this man was created for greatness. His immense diligence, his distancing from all the pleasures of life, his wonderful perseverance, and the straight inclination to delve deeply into all areas of Torah, to deviate from the path of the crooked pilpul and to search to the correct Torah, truth and Torah, all these testify that this Torah scholar was destined to be an illuminator of the paths of Torah and a straightener of the ways of learning for many of his generation. I don't think it is coincidence, right, that this line, that he was at the age of 14 married to the daughter of Rav Itzala, appears right before he writes. Even in his youth, he realized he was destined for greatness, because that makes sense, right? That is generally what would have happened in that world. So this is published in 1887, well before any of those other texts were published. This, to me, feels like a much more accurate representation of who the young Netziv was. Interestingly, you know who wrote this? He signed his name at the bottom. See it? Right. In fact, it's the earliest thing that Rav Kook publishes. Yep. Okay, good. So that's argument number two. Okay, argument number one was, would Rav Itzla married his daughter to Shlomazel? Argument number two is that Rav Kook, during the lifetime of the Netziv, in a publication that the Netziv certainly could have and probably did read, right, describes him as having been pretty bright as a young man as well. To take you on a slightly different journey now, to show you another indication that at least early on in the Netziv's career, he was rather known for his scholarship. This is a newspaper published in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, Ohio, in the mid-19th century was known as the home of what? Oh, okay, very good, excellent. Okay, good. Home of the Reform movement. Right? The Reform movement in America really emerges from Cincinnati. Excellent. So this was a Jewish newspaper published in 1856. So again, 1856, we are well before, right, any of the other texts that we've seen so far, right? And the Netziv is a young man still in 1856. And my interest in this particular volume edition of this newspaper is this article. I know it's hard to read. It says, "My Travels in Russia" by Dr. Lilienthal. That is Dr. Lilienthal. Okay, does it make sense that he's publishing in a reform newspaper, or a newspaper in a reform community? Does he look like a reform rabbi? Yeah. Right? So does he, right? Yes, that is Rav Samson Rachel Hirsch. Okay. All right. So I don't know, it was just fun. Has no bearing on our story, but yes, they dressed incredibly similarly. So no, you wouldn't necessarily know that he was reformed when he took this from this picture alone. Okay, back to our story. Who is Max Lilienthal? Some of you may remember we actually mentioned Max Lilienthal in a previous lecture, which I'm sure you all remember. I'm going to remind you just for the sake of the people who weren't there. Okay. To get to Max Lilienthal, we have to go to something we discussed last year, and that is the beginnings of Haskalah, the beginning of enlightenment in Eastern Europe. And we told the story of the enlightenment, in the Eastern European enlightenment, having begun in the area of Galicia in southern Poland, and making its way from there up into the areas of Lithuania, particularly in the regions of Vilna. And we had this incredibly, once upon a time, we actually knew what this meant, right? But this incredibly complicated timeline over here, which showed, right, the progression from the 18th century to the 20th century, and the way in which Haskalah moves from Western Europe at the end of the 19th century into Galicia in the beginning of the 19th century, and then makes its way into Vilna by the middle of the 19th century, which is really when it begins to take off in Eastern Europe. And we said a critical moment in this was the appointment of Sergei Yuvarov, appointed by the Tsar as the minister of the interior for Tsarist Russia at the time. And his major initiative that really does seem to turn the tide, give the opportunity for Haskalah to spread in Eastern Europe, is his desire to create new schools for Jews, government-sponsored schools for Jews, an initiative which comes into effect in 1844 when he passes this law on establishing special schools for the education of Jewish youth. Just as a reminder, Yuvarov's project, what he wanted to do was to integrate / assimilate Jews into Russian society. The Jews presented this great problem, right? There were millions of them that they inherited or conquered when they took over Poland, and they were a thorn in their side of the Russian Empire. They wanted to make them Russian. They wanted to Russify them. And so this was the goal, was to create schools for Jews that were going to be controlled by the government so they could control their curriculum and hopefully teach them how to become good and proper Russians. The first one opens in 1849. We said by 1855, there are 71 of these schools, but the impact of these schools really isn't the number of students who attended them, because it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of Jews and Jewish youth who were in schools in Eastern Europe at that time. The impact was really that it gave visibility and confidence to the Maskilim. Maskilim could get jobs there. Before that, there was no place for them, for these more enlightened intellectuals. You couldn't live in the Jewish community of Eastern Europe with these sort of more modern ideas. These schools gave them a base from which to work, from which to write, and that really allows them a certain sense of financial independence from the traditional community, and also begins to create this rift within traditional society. What does this have to do with our story, you might ask? Well, before Yuvarov goes ahead in 1844 passing this law, he wants to marshal support for this idea. He wants Jews to get on board with the idea of sending their children to Russian schools, well, to Jewish schools run by the Russian government. And so his idea was, I'm going to send a rabbi on a tour of the Pale of Settlement of the major Jewish communities to tell them what we have in mind and gain their support for this idea. Now, what Jew in Eastern Europe is going to go around from shtetl to shtetl, convincing people to send their kids to a state-sponsored school for Jews? Well, most of them were not. He found a willing participant in a headmaster of a school in Riga. Riga was a port city that had a largely German Jewish community in it and had a more modern school in it, headed by a man by the name of Dr. Max Lilienthal. So he was appointed. He was appointed in 1841 to travel the Pale of Settlement, right, the massive area in which Jews lived in Eastern Europe, and to try to get support for Uvarov's initiative, and then to report back to him and tell him how it went. How do you think it went? Yeah, not terribly well. Which is kind of why Max Lilienthal ends up leaving. He leaves Eastern Europe. He goes to Cincinnati, right? Becomes a reform rabbi there, and that works out a lot better for him. But he decides after he leaves in 1856, this is going to make for great reading. I'm going to publish an account of the account that he took, the diaries that he took as he was traveling through Eastern Europe, because American Jews would love to read about Eastern Europe and what is happening in those communities. So he writes this piece called My Travels in Russia. And it happens to be that in this piece, he describes having to come to Volozhin. And here's what he writes. Now, again, he's writing about what year? 1841. This is published in 1856, but he's writing about his travels in 1841. Right? And so how old is the Netziv in 1841? 25. Right, now we're getting pretty close to the young Netziv. Okay, I arrived in Volozhin on Sunday afternoon, 3 o'clock. It is an unimportant little town, deriving the support of its inhabitants from the large number of Jewish students visiting the renowned yeshiva. Being market day, the streets were exceedingly lively, and accosting the first Jew whom I met, I told him to show me to the house of Rabbi Itzela. Are you the Deutsche Rav? Right? Are you the German rabbi? Was the question addressed to me by 100 bystanders. And when answering in the affirmative, I saw 50 of them running away in the direction of the rabbi's lodging to inform him of my arrival. My driver followed them, and 5 minutes afterwards, I alighted at the rabbi's house. I was received by his son-in-law, Rabbi Leibela, Hirsch Leib, a man of some 30 years, he's actually younger than that, and one of the most celebrated Talmudists in Russia. Max Lilienthal had no reason to describe him that way. That there was nothing in it for him. This is what we would call the Siach Lefitumo. He's describing the man who was described to him at the age of 25 as one of the most celebrated Talmudists in all of Russia. So could it be that he makes this massive transition from the kid who was going to be a shoemaker and the person who was already married to the daughter of Rav Itzela, and Rav Itzela himself didn't know that he was that he had any sort of intellectual gifts, and but yet by 25 he's one of the most celebrated Talmudists in Russia? It could have happened that way, right? But unlikely. Oh, so we have no first-hand account of the story itself. He was married to Rav Itzela's daughter at the age of 14. According to Rav Kook, he was created for greatness even in his youth, and we know that Max Lilienthal calls him one of the greatest or most celebrated Talmudists in all of Russia by the time he was 25. So chances are he was actually of pretty above average intelligence. He was a pretty remarkable young scholar. We know that his Perush on the Sifrei was something he was working on already in his late teens, and it is a pretty remarkable work. Good, so then why the misconception? Why is he portrayed the way that he's portrayed? We're going to get to that, but let's detour for a minute and talk a little bit more about his life. Okay, we've mentioned already that he was the Rosh Yeshiva, he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. Well, how does that happen? It is not without challenge. So back to our genealogy. So first Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin is Rav Chaim of Volozhiner. Rav Chaim of Volozhiner dies, Rav Itzela of Volozhiner, his son, takes over after him. Rav Itzela of Volozhin dies in 1849, and it is not the Netziv who takes over after Rav Itzela of Volozhin, but rather, as we saw in one of the previous texts, it is Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried who takes over as the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. Not only is he a very well-established Talmud Chacham in his own right, but again, his yichus is unassailable. Right? Unassailable, he's a grandson of Rav Chaim from both sides, and he's got the mind. Clearly, this was going to be the Rosh Yeshiva. And the Netziv, though, was appointed to be his number two. Right? The way in which Volozhin functioned already in the time of Rav Itzla is that you had a Rosh Yeshiva and you had an assistant, you had a number two. So Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried was that to Rav Itzla. Rav Itzla dies. Rav Itzla, as you may have seen already, the Netziv, Rav Itzla asked the Netziv to start giving shiurim in the yeshiva already in the lifetime of Rav Itzla. And so he was already giving shiurim. It made sense that he would become number two to Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried. It happens to be that Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried gets sick and dies as a young man. So 4 years later, Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried is died. So now Volozhin needs a new Rosh Yeshiva. You would think it makes sense, right? That the Netziv should take over. Why might that not make so much sense? What would be the problem with the Netziv taking over? He's somewhat young. True. What else? He's not a son of the previous one. Okay? Or to say it, to expand it a little bit further, he's actually only married into the family. He is not a direct, the previous two Rosh Yeshiva have been direct descendants of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. We don't, so the question is, right, does somebody else from one of the other lines who is a direct descendant take over? Right? Or should it be Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin the Netziv? So the major controversy happens around Rav Yoshua Heschel Lev. He absolutely wanted to be the next Rosh Yeshiva. He started giving shiurim in Volozhin, in his house, trying to position himself to become the next Rosh Yeshiva. It becomes a bit of a controversy to the point in which two major Rabbanim from the of the time are invited in, are asked to come in and determine once and for all who should be the Rosh Yeshiva. Should it be Yehoshua Heschel Levin or should it be the Netziv? So it's Rav Zalman Zev was the Magid of Vilna and Rav Tevela of Minsk. They come in, they make a decision. The Netziv is to be the Rosh Yeshiva, and his assistant is not even Rav Yehoshua Heschel Levin. It is to be Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. He is to be number two. Rav Yehoshua Heschel Levin is out. So say the Rabbanim. Then comes a letter drafted, right, who ratified this decision by Rav David Luria. We've heard his name already. Shlomo Zalman Rivlin of Shklov, Joseph the Meir of Slutsk, Yaakov Meir Pato of Brisk, Rav Mordechai of Raziani. I don't really know how to say that word. They establish that this psak is right. The Netziv is the rightful heir to the throne of Volozhin. As you can imagine, though, not everybody necessarily agreed with that decision. There were many who felt that the right person for the job was actually Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik had proven himself to be already at that time quite the Talmud Chacham himself, right? Really an incredible mind. And so there begins to develop a rift in the yeshiva, right? With some people siding with the Netziv and others siding with Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. There is tension in this institution. Right from the outset, from the moment the Netziv takes over, there is palpable tension to the point where just a few years later, in 1856, they again need to call Rabbanim in to again decide, was this decision the right decision, right? And if not, ought we to change it? Or how do we calm things down, end the politics once and for all? This time, right, Rav Zalman Zev of Vilna comes in addition to Rav David Tevela of Minsk, Rav Yosef Slutsk, and a young rabbi by the name of Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, invited in to make the decision this time, and again they decide that the Netziv is to be the Rosh Yeshiva, and Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik is to be his assistant. The decision is a little bit more complicated. They get into what the pay of each of them should be, who makes the decisions on accepting students, on financial matters. It's a really, I mean, if you think Volozhin wasn't a real institution, it absolutely was, with all the complications that come along with it. That happens in 1856, and for 8 years they will work side by side with one another until in 1864, Shoemaker leaves Volozhin to become the rabbi of Slutsk, not the rabbi of Brisk. That doesn't happen until significantly later. Good. Okay. The story, though, will continue. The Netziv will, for the 40 years, from the time he is appointed in 1853 until close to his death, really 1891, he is the Rosh Hashanah. Right? And after, certainly by the time Rabbi Soloveitchik leaves in 1864, he is the established Rosh Yeshiva. It is the largest yeshiva in the world. It is the most famous yeshiva in the world. It attracts the top Talmidim in the world, really from all over the world. There were students from America who would come to learn in Volozhin, from all over, from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe. It is the Aim HaYeshivos, as it was known. As the Netziv begins to get older, right, there's actually a series of assistants that he will appoint. In 1881, right, prior to 1881, it is his son-in-law, Rabbi Perl Shapira, who is a Talmid Chacham in his own right. In 1881, he was the second to the Netziv. He gives it up to become a community rabbi, and the Netziv then appoints Chaim Soloveitchik. So remember, Chaim Soloveitchik was not his grandson, but his granddaughter's husband, right? So he's a grandson-in-law who actually had been a Talmud in Volozhin. He learned with his father, but he also came to study in Volozhin, and he became a Ben Bayis at the Netziv's home. We really became quite close with him. He's appointed to be number 2. So the Volozhin in its heyday, right, as it's remembered, is post-1881, when you had these two giants at the head and the helm of this yeshiva. You had the Netziv, and you had a much younger Chaim Soloveitchik. But there's history there, right? There's history there in that family. There was a feud in the in the previous generation, right, between his father and the Netziv. And there will be a feud again, this time not really between Chaim Soloveitchik and the Netziv, but between Chaim Soloveitchik and who will take over for the Netziv. Because as the Netziv gets older, it becomes clear that he needs a successor. He needs a successor, and the question is, who is that going to be? The obvious answer to anybody who was in the yeshiva at the time would be Chaim Soloveitchik. Clearly, he was the one, and there's no doubt, right, that by the time the Chaim Soloveitchik is on the scene, his mind, his shiurim were the attraction in Volozhin, for sure. But Netziv was an older man already at that point. His style of learning was very different than that of Chaim Soloveitchik. Chaim Soloveitchik reportedly said that everything he learned from Netziv, right? But their styles were extremely different. The Netziv was focused on breadth. Right? He had the command of Kol HaTorah Kula, right? And was always looking at how various pieces throughout all of Torah, when I say all of Torah, I mean Tanakh, I mean Medrash, right? I mean all of Gemara, I mean works that people didn't generally learn, like Sheiltos. Right? These things were all at his fingertips, and to really understand his method, you needed to be with him, right? Throughout the world of Torah learning. Which is not to say Chaim Soloveitchik didn't do those things, but Chaim Soloveitchik's approach and his methodology is extremely deep. He would focus you in on sort of a narrow area, a single sugya, right? And ask a question, come up with a chakira in this. And yes, it had ramifications in other areas of halacha for sure. But the focus was on sort of the intellectual exercise of going deep in this particular place and how we can understand the conceptual basis of what's happening in the sugya. You didn't need to know the rest of Shas in order to enjoy that kind of simulation. And so without a doubt, Chaim Soloveitchik becomes the more popular of the two Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. And so from the student perspective, it was a shoo-in. It was to be Chaim Soloveitchik. However, in 1891, the Netziv chooses his son, Chaim Berlin, who had only come back to the yeshiva at the invitation of his father only a year or two prior to that. And as you can imagine, right, if you're a Volozhiner faithful, this is not going to sit very well with you. Not to say that Chaim Berlin was a lightweight, but he was not Chaim Soloveitchik. And never would the two be confused with one another. It seems that the reason why the Netziv chose, if we're going to be gracious to the Netziv, right, the reason that he chose Chaim Berlin is Chaim Berlin actually married in his first marriage into quite a bit of wealth. And he actually proved himself to be quite a good adept administrator. He had managed significant finances before. He had been a community rabbi in Moscow. He had been an administrator before, and it seems the Netziv felt that he would make a much better administrator. Chaim Soloveitchik was a brilliant Talmid Chacham, but being a brilliant Talmid Chacham doesn't necessarily make you a great administrator for an institution of 500 students. And we know, by the way, that the Netziv spent a lot of his time engaged in that kind of work. He signed every single one of his tshuvos, almost be'avoda, right? Buried neckine work, right? That's what he did. So anyway, it becomes quite an issue again, right, in the right at the end of the Netziv's life. So again, you have a battle between the world of the families of the Soloveitchiks and the families of the Berlins. Oh, hold that thought for a minute. Let me just introduce you to the works of the Netziv. What is he known for? What did he write? And when was it published? So you've seen reference already to his work, Ha'amik She'ela, right? The story of the Shoemaker story is when he completes this work of Ha'amik She'ela. Ha'amik She'ela was considered by the Netziv to be his magnum opus. He is known today for this work, his Perush on Chumash, because it's a lot more accessible. Many more people are learning Parshat Shavua than people who are learning She'utos. But the Netziv considered this to be his great work. The work of Rav Chai Gaon on the She'utos was not that popular, was not studied that much. The Netziv felt it offered incredibly important insight into the development of halacha, that you could understand so much of what was in the poskim, the later poskim, by understanding what the Gaonim had before them, and especially many of the questions that emerged, right, which later in the Brisker Derech will be resolved through sort of intellectual exercises. He would like to show you that there are sources that can actually resolve these, and the She'utos was his go-to place, at least early on. Ha'amik Davar is a perush on Chumash, right? Quite popular still very much today. Incredibly creative, incredibly close reading of the text. Also kind of takes one of the first to take more of a bird's eye view, sort of a macrocosmic view of what is happening over the course of various areas in the Chumash, rather than just focusing in on one. Rina Shel Torah is the perush that he writes on Shir HaShirim. There's also an essay at the end, and it's translated into English. I don't remember the name. It'll come to me. But there's an essay in the end on anti-Semitism, which, yes, it's still very much relevant, worth reading. Written following the 1881 pogroms, so probably around 1882, 1883. And it is available in English. You can. The English name will come to me. Imre Shefer, that's the Netziv's perush on the Haggadah. Meishiv Davar, this is a collection of his tshuvos. So they were. This was in publication already when the Netziv died, so he knew that they were publishing it, but he never actually saw it published. Meromei Sadar are his insights into Gemara. Eimek HaNetziv, this is his perush on the Sifrei, published for the first time in 1959. And Birkas HaNetziv, that's his perush on the Mechilta. This will be more of our focus next time, but this work, published in 1959, is actually the earliest work that he wrote, right? So publication date does not necessarily reflect composition date. Right? This is what he was working on. This is as well as a young man. This perush on Chumash was actually an outgrowth of one of the other rather novel things that the Netziv did, which is he gave a shir on Chumash every day. And it was a parsha year, so they would go every day. They would learn that week's parsha. But his perush on Chumash is an outgrowth of the Parsha Shiurim he would give in Volozhin. Okay, good. Let's talk about the legacy because we're coming up on our time. Who does he leave right behind him, and then we'll come back to the question that we started with. Well, it basically reads as a who's who of the major Gedolim that will come right in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, all learned at various points with the Netziv. So Chaim Ozer Brzezinski, Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, Rav Shimon Shkop, Rav Yitzchak Cohen Cook, we've already seen, all Talmidim of the Netziv. Rav Zalman Meltzer, Rav Avram Dover Kadosh Shapiro, Rav Baruch Ber Leibovitz, Shlomo Polachek, who we spoke about in the previous shir as well. And you can see the various yeshivos that they learned in or that they taught in, whether it was Slutsk or in Yerushalayim, right? Slobodka and Kamenetz, and Rav Baruch Ber is obviously the famous author of the Birkas Shmuel. Shlomo Polachek will come to the United States to Rietz, right, and bring the Torah of the Netziv here. But these aren't the only Talmidim of the Netziv. His own children, his own family, right? So we talked about Chaim Berlin, we talked about Rav Meir Bar Ilan. His son-in-law, Rav Perl Shapiro, major Talmid Chacham also, author of the Torah Rafal, right? And the father-in-law of Chaim Soloveitchik, and of course of Chaim Soloveitchik himself. There were other Talmidim, though, that the Netziv had, who also went on to quite a bit of fame. They don't exactly look the same. We'll get to them in just a minute. Let's come back to the question that I asked earlier. Why the misconception? Why is it that the Netziv is portrayed as a young man of average intelligence, as a young man whose genius wasn't known by his father? And I think the simplest answer to that question goes back to this tension between the Soloveitchik family and the Berlin family, right, which starts here, right, and then continues down here. And the ultimate answer to the question is that these people, not these people, but these people, who were also absolutely Talmidim of the Netziv, were also very much Talmidim of Rav Chaim. And in fact, their methodology, and the methodology that would dominate the turn of the 20th century and into the 20th century, and that dominates most Lithuanian yeshivos to this day, is the methodology of Chaim Soloveitchik. It's the Brisker methodology, or in other words, Brisk wins. In this competition between the Berlin family and the Soloveitchik family, it is the Soloveitchik family that will win in terms of popularity, in terms of influence in the development of our yeshivos, in terms of the way in which we learn and the way we think about learning. And my argument is that by the time that even his son-in-law and his son are publishing in the 1920s and the 1940s, the approach of the Briskers has so dominated the world of yeshiva learning that when you look back at what the Netziv was doing, it almost jumps out at you that he's not Chaim Soloveitchik. He's not a Brisker. Right? He's learning in a very different way. His learning is all about how much he's learned, his breadth, the fact that he has studied so much in so many different areas, and he can bring those together. It's not this flash of insight. It's not this brilliant chakira. It's this breadth that he has and seems to have accumulated over all of Shas. And where does one gain such things from? You gain that from a long time of study on your own. It's not somebody who's born with some sort of gift who can immediately see, right, something that nobody else saw and take it apart. It sort of fits with the way in which the world of the yeshivos have developed. And when you then retrospectively look back on the Netziv, I think he looks like a boy of average intelligence. I think in the world of the yeshivos, there's a desire to see a Rosh Yeshiva who wasn't born as an Eloi, right? And that becomes who the Netziv was, rather than actually being who the Netziv was. Take it or leave it. That's what I think. We're not finished yet, though, because we have just a few more people to introduce you to, and then we'll call it quits for the night. And that are this group of students of the Netziv. Oh, wow, they look a little different than the previous people on the screen. Avram Harkavy, head of the Oriental Division at the Imperial Library in St. Petersburg, a historian and prolific author. Chaim Nachman Bialik, a pioneer of modern Hebrew, national poet of Israel. Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, a journalist, an author in Hebrew, Yiddish, and German, a scholar of early Jewish literature. Zalman Epstein, a Hebrew essayist and critic, secular Zionist, and contributor to early Hebrew newspapers. If we notice their heads, right, they don't look like the previous people on the screen. And so that raises the question, how did that happen? How did that happen? How does the Netziv produce the greatest Gedolim of the next generation, and also some of the greatest secular thinkers and producers of culture in their generation? Is it coincidence? Or might they both find their roots in the man of the Netziv? And that's the question that we will pick up with next time as we look at what the Rosh Yeshiva was reading. Good night.